Mercedes thought Monaco had delivered a perfect victory. But the FIA saw something else. Kimi Antonelli, 19 years old, crossed the line first after taking pole, controlling the race, surviving a red flag, and beating Lewis Hamilton in Ferrari red by 6.271 seconds. That should have ended the story. Instead, it opened the investigation. Because behind Antonelli's win, Monaco was collapsing into a storm of pit lane penalties, restart violations, a broken track surface, Russell's disaster race, Hadjar's podium under threat, and a Mercedes car that rival teams were already watching with suspicion. And here is the part that makes this dangerous. Antonelli may not have been the driver directly accused of breaking the race rules, but his biggest win was now surrounded by the one thing Mercedes feared most: doubt. The FIA did not just investigate a result. It exposed the pressure building around the most dominant team in Formula One. And if Mercedes thought winning Monaco would silence the paddock, they were wrong. Because this victory may have made everyone look even closer. Subscribe to the channel. Monaco is the one race where a perfect result can still become a problem. That is what made Mercedes' weekend so dangerous from the beginning. Because Antonelli did not arrive in Monte Carlo as a normal winner, a lucky rookie, or a young driver simply enjoying his first taste of pressure. He arrived as the driver the entire paddock was already studying. 19 years old. Leading the championship. Driving the Mercedes W17. Winning so early, so often, and so calmly that rival teams were no longer just impressed. They were suspicious. And that matters, because suspicion changes everything in Formula One. When a team is struggling, nobody checks every tiny detail with the same intensity. Nobody listens closely to every engine note. Nobody studies every sector time like it might reveal a secret. But when a team starts dominating, the sport reacts differently. The cameras zoom in. The rival engineers lean forward. The FIA receives questions. And suddenly, every fast lap becomes evidence for someone's theory. That was the atmosphere around Mercedes before Monaco even began. Earlier in the season, rival teams had raised concerns about the Mercedes power unit. The FIA reviewed the situation. Mercedes denied wrongdoing. No formal punishment followed. But the important part is this. Being cleared does not always mean being trusted. Not in Formula One. Because this sport is built on tiny advantages. A slight gain on the straight. A cleaner exit from a slow corner. A better launch. A car that seems to recover speed a little too well. These things may be completely legal, but rivals are trained to notice them, question them, and push the governing body to look deeper. So when Antonelli arrived in Monaco, he was not only carrying the championship lead. He was carrying the weight of every unanswered question around Mercedes. And then he did the one thing that made the pressure even bigger. He took pole. Not at an ordinary circuit. At Monaco. The place where qualifying can feel more important than the race itself. The place where a Saturday lap can decide an entire Sunday. The place where starting first does not guarantee safety, but starting anywhere else can feel like a sentence. Antonelli's lap was exactly what Mercedes needed. Sharp. Cold. Controlled. A lap that put Mercedes at the front in Monte Carlo and forced the rest of the grid to accept a painful truth. The teenager was not disappearing under pressure. He was growing inside it. But here is where the trap begins. A dominant qualifying lap at Monaco does not only give you track position. It gives everyone else a target. And Antonelli's target was enormous. Behind him was Max Verstappen, close enough to make the opening seconds dangerous. Behind them was Lewis Hamilton, now in Ferrari red, carrying one of the most emotional storylines in the sport. And behind Hamilton was Charles Leclerc, the home driver, the local hero, the man trying once again to defeat the race that had hurt him so many times before. That front group was not just fast. It was loaded with meaning. Antonelli represented the future. Hamilton represented history trying to fight back. Leclerc represented Monaco's heartbreak. Verstappen represented the champion who refused to be replaced quietly. And Mercedes stood in the middle of all of it, knowing that a win would make them stronger, but also more exposed. Because every dominant team faces the same uncomfortable truth. Winning brings points. Dominating brings scrutiny. And Mercedes were already under the microscope. Then came the first warning signs. They were small enough that most fans could have missed them, but important enough that the race later made them feel much bigger. Pittsburgh lane speeding fines appeared during practice. Antonelli was fined for going just over the limit. Russell was fined as well. Alonso also had a fine. Tiny margins. Tiny numbers. The kind of thing that looks almost meaningless when compared with a Monaco pole position. But that is how these weekends often begin. Not with a scandal. With a pattern. A minor breach here. A small decision there. A rule that seems harmless until the same rule starts shaping the race. And at Monaco, the pit lane is not just a place where cars change tires. It is a pressure chamber. It is narrow, slow, and brutally controlled. Drivers are trying to lose as little time as possible, while also obeying a limit that gives them no emotional room. Go slightly too fast, and the rule does not care that you were only slightly wrong. The limit is the limit. That detail would later become one of the defining themes of the entire Grand Prix. And Mercedes had reason to be nervous, because one of their drivers had already been caught by that line before Sunday even arrived. Not enough to damage Antonelli's weekend, but enough to show that Monaco was watching every inch. This is where the race started to feel less like a simple victory attempt, and more like a trap being built in slow motion. Antonelli had the pole. Mercedes had the fastest storyline. The championship lead was on their side. But the weekend already contained the ingredients of trouble. A car rivals had questioned. A governing body that had already reviewed Mercedes earlier in the season. A pit lane producing small infractions. A circuit where overtaking is nearly impossible. A front row and second row full of drivers who all had reasons to make the race emotional. And a young leader who could not afford even one careless moment. Because for Antonelli, the danger was not only losing the race. The danger was winning it in a way that created even more questions. That sounds unfair, but it is real. If a struggling team wins once, people call it a miracle. If a dominant team wins again, people call it a pattern. And if that pattern starts to feel too strong, Formula One starts searching for the hidden explanation. That is what Mercedes were facing. Their best argument was Antonelli himself. His calmness. His precision. His ability to take the most difficult circuit in the world and make it look controlled. But that same calmness made the story even more dangerous for their rivals. Because a 19-year-old should not make Monaco look easy. A rookie should not be able to arrive with the championship lead, take pole, and make the rest of the grid look like it was chasing a driver already ahead of his own era. And when something feels too impressive, Formula One does not simply applaud. It investigates. That is why the opening phase of this weekend mattered so much. Before the red flag. Before the broken track surface. Before Hadjar's podium came under threat. Before Perez's historic point became uncertain. Before Russell's race collapsed under penalties. Before the provisional classification turned Mercedes' celebration into a tense waiting game. The pressure was already there. Hidden in the garage. Hidden in the rulebook. Hidden in the way rival teams watched the silver car at the front. And Mercedes knew it. They knew Antonelli had to do more than win. He had to win cleanly. He had to win calmly. He had to give the FIA nothing. He had to give the paddock no obvious weakness. He had to drive through the most watched weekend of his career without giving the story a reason to turn against him. But Monaco does not care what a team needs. Monaco creates its own story. And by the time Antonelli rolled toward the grid, the race had already become bigger than one driver, one trophy, or one Sunday afternoon. It had become a test of Mercedes under maximum pressure. A test of whether Antonelli's dominance was simply the beginning of a new era. A test of whether the FIA would find something, anything, in a weekend where the smallest mistakes were already starting to appear. And that is what made the start feel so heavy. The cars were lined up. The walls were waiting. Hamilton was behind him. Verstappen was beside the threat. Leclerc had the weight of Monaco on his shoulders. And Antonelli sat at the front, knowing the same thing Mercedes knew. If he lost, the paddock would call him beatable. But if he won too cleanly, too calmly, too convincingly, the questions around Mercedes might only get louder. The race started with the kind of moment Mercedes desperately needed. Antonelli launched cleanly. No hesitation. No visible panic. No opening for the cars behind. At Monaco, that matters more than almost anywhere else, because the start is not just the beginning of the race. It can become the entire race in a few seconds. If you lead into the first corners, you force everyone else to play your game. If you lose that lead, Monaco can trap you behind another car for the rest of the afternoon. Antonelli knew that. Mercedes knew that. And the entire grid knew that if the 19-year-old escaped the first lap in front, the pressure would shift immediately onto everyone chasing him. He did escape. But the first twist arrived almost instantly. Max Verstappen's Red Bull stalled. The driver many expected to be Antonelli's most dangerous early threat was gone before the fight could truly begin. No long battle. No strategic duel. No dramatic overtake attempt. Just a brutal mechanical exit that removed one of the biggest names from the Monaco Grand Prix almost at once. For Mercedes, that should have been relief. But relief at Monaco never lasts long. Because Verstappen's retirement did not make the race safe. It simply moved the danger somewhere else. And that danger was Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton was still there, close enough to make Mercedes uncomfortable. Charles Leclerc was still in the fight, carrying all the emotion of his home race. And with Verstappen gone, the whole shape of the race changed. It was no longer Antonelli against Red Bull at the front. It was Antonelli against Ferrari, Monaco, and the growing suspicion around Mercedes. That is a very different kind of race. Hamilton did not need to attack immediately. He only needed to stay close enough to keep Mercedes thinking. Close enough to influence pit strategy. Close enough to make every lap feel measured. Close enough to remind Antonelli that one mistake would not be forgiven. This is the hidden cruelty of leading in Monaco. From the outside, it can look calm. A car in clean air, a small gap, a race under control. But inside the cockpit, nothing feels calm. The walls do not move. The barriers do not forgive. The tires change constantly. The steering never truly rests. And every time the radio opens, the driver knows the next message could change the race. Antonelli had to drive fast enough to protect the lead, but not so aggressively that he damaged the tires. He had to keep Hamilton out of reach, but not push himself into the wall. He had to look calm, even while the most famous street circuit in the world was waiting for one young driver mistake. And here is the part that made the pressure even sharper. Every clean lap Antonelli completed made Mercedes look stronger. Every tenth he controlled made the paddock look closer. Every time he crossed the line still leading, the question grew. Was this just a brilliant young driver making history, or was Mercedes holding an advantage the rest of Formula One still did not understand? That question had followed them into Monaco. Now it was riding with them through every corner. But while Antonelli was keeping the front under control, the race behind him began to unravel. The pit lane became the trap. Not a crash zone. Not an overtaking zone. Not the famous tunnel or the swimming pool. The pit lane. The slowest, most controlled part of the circuit became one of the most damaging places in the entire Grand Prix. Hamilton was penalized for speeding during his stop. Russell was penalized too. Gasly would suffer from pit lane violations. Other drivers were caught in the same pattern. And suddenly, the tiny practice fines from earlier in the weekend no longer felt like background noise. They felt like warning signs. Monaco had been showing the grid the danger all along. The pit lane speed limit is simple in theory. Stay below the limit. Do not cross the line. Do not give the FIA a reason to act. But in the middle of a Monaco Grand Prix, that simple rule becomes brutal. Drivers are trying to lose as little time as possible. Teams are trying to protect track position. Engineers are counting gaps that can disappear in seconds. One fraction too much speed, one imperfect entry, one release that feels slightly too aggressive, and a race can begin to fall apart. That is exactly what started happening. For Hamilton, the penalty hurt, but it did not destroy him. He remained in the fight, still close enough to keep pressure on Antonelli, still on course for a major Ferrari result. For Russell, it became much worse. His race began sliding into a chain of problems that made Mercedes look divided between glory and disaster. A 5-second penalty hurt him. Then came complications around serving it correctly. Later, a drive-through penalty during the restart period left his afternoon in ruins. By the end, Russell was classified 13th. That number mattered. Because while Antonelli was leading Monaco like a future champion, Russell was buried in one of the messiest weekends of his season. Same team. Same car family. Same race. Completely different outcomes. And Formula One always notices contrasts like that. Sometimes the explanation is simple. Traffic. Timing. Strategy. Mistakes. Bad luck. Different race circumstances. But when Mercedes is already under scrutiny, contrast becomes fuel. One car at the front, looking almost untouchable. One car in trouble, collecting penalties. A paddock already asking questions. An FIA already involved in the weekend. That is how a normal race becomes a pressure cooker. And the deeper problem was that the stewards were no longer a side story. They were becoming part of the race. Every penalty changed the shape of the points. Every investigation created another possible version of the final result. Every driver under review made the timing screen feel less reliable. The race was still happening on the streets. But another race was beginning in the documents. That is when Mercedes' situation became more fragile. Because Antonelli could control his braking points, his tires, his exits, and his pace. He could manage Hamilton behind him. He could avoid the walls. He could keep the car clean.